Ontology, what's ontology in relation to these two? Well, ontology is going to say, well, hang on, if you just mind, if it's all just mind and ideas, what is the being of that mind? Now, and is it just mind? So that's singularity of monism again. Your monism issuing from metaphysics, that is your attempt to give an account of reality. Ontology, giving an account of the account, if you like, because the account of reality is going to make a claim, and that claim is going to have to match with experience, so you're going to have to engage in this question of relationship to objects, and whether the whole, speaking about the whole of reality, is in fact just a kind of abstraction. Can you get to the worldhood of the world, if you like to be follow Heidegger's phrase, worldhood? Is there something that you can get to called worldhood, and how could we apply our minds to it? It's as if reality is an abstraction. But we are smart creatures, we can go bigger and bolder than that, and I think for this part of it, let's see, not only do we have that abstract problem, it seems that even if you could get around that kind of ridiculousness of philosophy, that it could, you know, get a hold of reality and make a decent statement about it, and not be universal. This is the ridiculous part, that the claims are attempts at being universal, and we have to kind of shed universalism, just as we've shed idealism, realism. Now, they are isms because they grew, they expanded human life, if you like, and they now stand. There is realism, there is idealism in the world. Idealism and realism can be a critique, if you like, but mostly they are past philosophies that engaged in the question of universalism, which is to say, engage the question of metaphysics and not necessarily engage in the question of ontology. So the ontological question here is, okay, you've made this claim, not necessarily a universal claim, but you've made a claim about reality that there is a singular thing, and that singular thing is material. Okay, that was good till 1930s. Okay, so bit of irony there that Being in Time, Heidegger's big book, came out about that time. I don't know the ins and outs of scientific history, but the question of being, he believed, was sort of overlooked in Western metaphysics or Western philosophy, and so set about engaging with that further. Now, since Heidegger, philosophy has marched on a bit further, and the concept being that he did introduce and really gave us a great insight into relationships, such as our relationship with an object, in very practical terms, and thereby developed our overall subjectivity as creatures of motion and proximity and practice and adaptation, if you like. So there's a very, I feel, an organic element to Heidegger's emphasis on relationships. And for me, where I took that in my own thinking was to develop effectively what I call the primacy of relations. So just as we've mentioned objects, that we will have a relationship with objects, and this is a metaphysical conundrum, if you like, we have a relationship with objects. We relate to objects. It's not that there are just objects. And going back to those issues that I was raising earlier about the simplicity of an abstract object. So that we don't just have an object, that we have a simple relationship, but that we have relations. So the upshot for me, following on from Heidegger and others, is that there's a primacy about relationships as opposed to objects. Whereas I would argue, even today still, science will emphasise the objects. The part of the fact, the part of the fact of the object, or the fact of the object, would be emphasised. But if you think about it, two things, or one thing even, really, just one thing, and remember, we're not getting away with it. If our metaphysics is monist, or one, we're not getting away from the difficulty of relationships. See, that's our experience. Our experience is relationships, and how is that possible if you don't have two kinds of things, or two of the same kind but which are separate in some way? Well, that just brings us back to our dimension. Obviously, space, its extension. I'm here, the window's over there. I mean, it's nothing amazing. But we use all this sort of furniture of the world to really break out of any kind of unclear thinking about what we're saying we're doing in terms of practice, relationships, objects, and so on and so on. So, where are we? The last little difficulty for us is language. Or the last issue that we're going to get back to up here. Language is going to be a feature here in ontology. So how should we use language such that we can make ontological claims over and above metaphysical claims? So ontology, is it just doing the same thing as metaphysics? It kind of is, it kind of isn't. With ontology, you've got its revival in Heidegger, particularly the concept. CP is my shorthand for concept. The concept of being. Now, so much so that ontology actually means theory of being. So, now, being will be being of what? Will it be being of a singular item that makes up reality? Now, ontology does not just consist of the concept being, there are other concepts. And the scientists would appreciate that they're not dealing with fixed objects, and relationship by definition is not a fixed thing. A relationship is a moving thing, as I say, where more or less organic, proximate, motive, we're a fluid kind of existence. Language is going to be relevant for ontology, and if you go into the history of philosophy, you'll find that we moved really from metaphysics of, say, the Enlightenment era, 18th century, claims about the whole once the kind of the reasoned or rational work was done around metaphysics, that you could get to these claims, but really it was metaphysics extracting themselves from the concept of God also. But more or less, metaphysics moved into epistemology, which is a more refined conception of knowledge that your traditional metaphysics was engaging or chasing down or proposing. But even from epistemology, which is more or less a kind of like a philosophy of science, if you like, a rationality around what we're doing with the objective world and how we are scientific. So effectively, it's kind of it would fall under realism. Metaphysics really did end up in idealism, and you can study Hegel and tell you how out doing that. Or you can just roll with the history of philosophy in terms of that move towards not so much ontology but the language. So the philosophy of language came to dominate. Now it reminds me a lot of philosophy of mind, but the thing about philosophy is language is really accounting for all the incomplete parts of epistemology. That is, that which took over from metaphysics and kind of made the metaphysical claims a bit more realistic. So again, we're moving from idealism to realism, if you like. And then its own realism coming under critique, particularly towards the end of the 19th century, particularly European, say, the American pragmatists might have been at it too, but particularly Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics really pointed to, probably 50 years ahead of Wittgenstein, the need for a philosophy of language, if you like. And in fact, he was doing a philosophy of language of sorts, being a philologist, really examining if we want to go back to relationships, really examining our relationship with the text itself. And not just the history of the text, and he gives us good history of texts, but ending really, if you like, in an understanding of texts, in our relationship with them. Not so much an understanding of this or that text, although you get plenty of that, but claims around what we do when we textualise, what we do with, I suppose he's really referring to discourse, the challenge of discourse, that in a certain sense, if you like, give you a flippant critique would be language or text is bodies using hot air, breathing, exhaling to produce sound. And that's a perfectly empirical explanation, if you like, a scientific or objective explanation of language. So I can stand here and talk, but there's a value in the words that I use. There's emphasis, intonation, and again, moving down the political track, because history is fairly political, you've got the issue of rhetoric, which surrounds language in a certain sense. It's, to use the French phrase in English, always already rhetoric. So linguistic elements are always already purposeful, not values-free. And that brings us back to our big question, is a values-free space possible? What we mean by space, maybe we mean is a value-free time possible. That's going to become more and more relevant, the more and more we're absorbed by the virtual world, which I believe is occurring, that people lean more and more on the virtual world, and therefore the question of practical relationships, so our relationship just on that basic level, on-face, objective relationships with items that are really quite complex. And they're not chairs anymore, they're interactive electronic devices which border on AI nowadays, and can have a hell of a lot of information behind the assumptions that they'll throw at the user. So what kind of relationship is that? Is it healthy? Should we give primacy to that rather than the content, if you like? So, as I was saying before, primacy of relationships over objects, but we can say primacy of relationships over just about anything that we think we value and want to raise up. But as philosophers, I think, and scientists too, that primacy of relationships, because scientists, they're going to study conditions under which the phenomena that they work with, the conditions under which that phenomena occurs, declines, degrades, or thrives, if you like. So, I mean, the obvious one would be climate change. I think the study of the conditions under which climate change becomes an issue. So, you're not really dealing with an object there, you're dealing with the set of relationships between all the elements, and the scientists that can cover the ground, from biodiversity through to geology and up to the atmosphere in terms of climate, then all those elements, how it gets put together, all those relationships, then you've given primacy to relationships, really. It's not so much, no one's disputing the objects involved so much. Although there's a hell of a lot of rhetoric and politics in the climate change. So it's left to politicians to explain the rate of change from an institutional point of view for the outcomes for the environment or the planet. So let's move now. Let's say there is only one element or one item called reality, and it's not made up of multiple things. Let's say that we can account for what that is. So ontologically, we can account for the being of material, if that's our monist item. If our reality is singular and it is made up of material, what is the being of that material? Well, we can lean heavily on science, but we're also handling the concept of being as well. So that pushes us, one, into language. So that's not the only thing that comes out of it. And anyway, it didn't really come out of it. I mean, philosophy marched on from epistemology into philosophy of language, regardless of what was going on in ontology, but not regardless of what was occurring in metaphysics. Metaphysics continued on. It's not as if these things get displaced. It's just that the knowledge gets deeper and wider, in theory at least. Nominalism's still surviving. It's quite compatible with the study of language, because language is not, or at least insofar as it studies, is not going to indulge too much, because it's a very close-knit study of what we do when we use language. It's, again, another relationship, our relationship with language. But nominalism is going to serve us well in philosophy of language, because nominalism is going to keep us just to the statements, just to the simple stuff, first of all, until we actually can justify the complexity, or at least our approach to the complexity, relationship again. And language really, that close study of language wipes out universalism. I mean, it's just a bit of behaviour, it's a bit of psychology that people want to make grand claims. And look, we've done that for centuries, and we've had a concept of God, which I suppose is the ultimate universal object. We've had that in the picture for a long, long time, and I think you can account for all the variation in the concept of God by examining language. I mean, the concept of God could be, 100 different things, and really you wouldn't get any further with it, I suppose, because it's got a missing bit. Anyway, let's move it now to here. So nihilism, that nil is the case. Now, what do I mean by that? That nil is the case. It doesn't mean anything, does it? I mean, it doesn't matter that there's nothing to speak of in nihilism.